Nathaniel Williams was born into a modest family in a quiet suburban town. His father, Richard Williams, was a mechanic who struggled to make ends meet, while his mother, Lydia, worked as a nurse in the local hospital. Growing up, Nathaniel knew the weight of financial hardship but always felt determined to change his future. He had big dreams that seemed impossible to realize for someone from his background. But with ambition and grit, he made it through high school with scholarships to a prestigious university, where he earned a degree in business. He quickly climbed the corporate ladder in a competitive, cutthroat industry and, before long, founded his own tech company. The company began with humble beginnings but exploded into a global empire, thanks to his unrelenting drive. In contrast, Sophia Martins, a woman of grace, intelligence, and beauty, was born into a well-off family in a different part of the country. Her father, Enrique Martins, was a renowned lawyer, and her mother, Clara, was a celebrated interior designer. Growing up in luxury, Sophia had everything anyone could ever ask for, yet she never took it for granted. Unlike other wealthy kids, she believed in the power of hard work and dedication. Her education was top-notch, and she graduated with honors from an Ivy League school in business management. Sophia had aspirations of her own. She wanted to leave a mark in the world, beyond the constraints of her family name. However, despite her many accomplishments, Sophia longed for real love, someone who saw her for who she truly was, and not just the product of her family's wealth. Their worlds collided one fateful evening at a business conference where both were invited as speakers. Nathaniel stood out with his charisma and sharp intellect, while Sophia captivated the audience with her elegance and insights. Their chemistry was undeniable. Nathaniel was immediately drawn to Sophia, and she, in turn, was intrigued by his confidence and vulnerability, a man who seemed to have defied all odds. After the event, they shared a quiet dinner where they exchanged their dreams and aspirations. Their connection was instant and intense, and that evening marked the beginning of a passionate relationship. They quickly became inseparable, with Nathaniel doting on Sophia, and Sophia being a grounding force in Nathaniel's often chaotic world. Despite the speed at which their relationship grew, Sophia remained cautious. She had seen her parents' marriage falter due to their own high expectations and emotional distance, and she wasn't about to settle for anything less than a partnership that was built on mutual respect and trust. Nathaniel, on the other hand, saw in Sophia not just a beautiful woman, but a true equal, someone who challenged him, yet accepted him for who he was. Their love grew stronger, and less than a year after they started dating, Nathaniel proposed to her in a private, intimate moment at one of their favorite spots, a quiet rooftop overlooking the city. Sophia said yes, and they soon began planning their wedding. Their grand wedding was a reflection of their success. It was held at a luxurious venue with stunning views, surrounded by their closest friends and family. The ceremony was nothing short of magical, with a crowd of loved ones watching as they exchanged vows under a canopy of twinkling lights. Their love story was perfect, a fairy tale that seemed destined for happiness. They were the golden couple, wealthy, successful, and deeply in love. Little did anyone know that, as their life together unfolded, cracks would slowly begin to appear beneath the surface. Sophia and Nathaniel's marriage began with passion, love, and excitement. After their honeymoon in the Maldives, they settled into a beautiful penthouse in the heart of the city. Nathaniel's company had grown exponentially, and he was constantly in the media, receiving awards and accolades for his achievements. On the surface, they appeared to have it all: riches, status, and a love that seemed unshakable. However, behind closed doors, their relationship was starting to change. Sophia adjusted to her new role as a wealthy wife with ease, but her once vibrant career ambitions began to take a back seat. Nathaniel, always busy with his work, rarely had time to spend with her. Though she didn't mind at first, after all, she had everything she ever wanted, she soon found herself feeling increasingly lonely. The glitz and glamour of their social life became more of a routine, and the intimate moments they once shared started to fade into the background. The lavish vacations, the dinners with influential people, and the parties were all distractions from a growing emptiness she couldn't ignore. The turning point came when Sophia found out she was pregnant. After the initial shock wore off, Nathaniel was overjoyed. The thought of becoming a father filled him with pride, and he showered Sophia with love and care during her pregnancy. Sophia, on the other hand, was nervous. She had always wanted children, but the prospect of balancing motherhood with her marriage to a man whose career was so demanding felt daunting. But Nathaniel assured her that they would figure it out together. After months of anticipation, Sophia gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom they named Ethan and Emma. The moment she held them in her arms, Sophia's world shifted. Her children became her everything, and she was determined to give them the best life possible. Nathaniel, too, seemed to bond with the babies, spending more time with them than he ever had with Sophia. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with sleepless nights, laughter, and the joy of parenthood. However, as time passed, Nathaniel's focus began to shift once more. His company's demands increased, and the pressure to maintain his position at the top took precedence over spending time with his family. At first, Sophia made excuses for him. She understood how important his work was and didn't want to burden him with her own feelings of neglect. But as the months turned into years, she began to feel the weight of his absence. The distance between them grew, and the loneliness that had once been fleeting became a constant companion. Nathaniel's business ventures exploded. The company he had founded became one of the most successful in the tech world, and his name became synonymous with success. The media adored him, and he was constantly sought after for interviews, conferences, and business deals. His wealth and influence grew, but so did his ego. He began to see himself as untouchable, and he became more focused on his image as a successful businessman than on his role as a husband and father. Sophia, once the confident and ambitious woman who had captured Nathaniel's heart, now found herself relegated to the background. She spent her days taking care of Ethan and Emma, managing the household, and attending social events at Nathaniel's side. Though she was outwardly supportive, the strain was beginning to show. Nathaniel's late nights at the office became more frequent, and when he did come home, he was distant, distracted by business calls or emails. Sophia tried to talk to him about her feelings, but Nathaniel brushed her off, claiming that she didn't understand the pressures he was facing. He began to make her feel as though she was too demanding, that her expectations of him were unrealistic. The love they once shared began to feel like a distant memory. It was around this time that Victor Carter, Nathaniel's best friend and business partner, began to play a more prominent role in their lives. Victor was a charming and outgoing man who had known Nathaniel for years, and the two shared a deep bond. However, Sophia began to notice a change in Victor's behavior. He became more involved in their personal affairs, often giving Nathaniel advice on how to deal with Sophia's growing dissatisfaction. It wasn't long before Sophia realized that Victor, too, was becoming more of a fixture in Nathaniel's life than she was. Victor's influence on Nathaniel was subtle but undeniable. He encouraged Nathaniel to take more business trips and to spend less time with his family. He told him that true success meant sacrificing personal relationships, and that Sophia, as beautiful and supportive as she was a distraction from his potential. Nathaniel began to take these words to heart, and it wasn't long before he started neglecting his responsibilities at home even more. It was during one of these long business trips that Nathaniel met Vanessa Hudson, a stunningly beautiful woman who worked in public relations for a high-end fashion company. Vanessa was sophisticated, charming, and highly ambitious, everything that Nathaniel admired. She was everything Sophia was not, unpredictable, spontaneous, and carefree. Where Sophia was grounded, Vanessa was the spark that ignited Nathaniel's desire for excitement and new experiences. At first, their relationship was purely professional. Vanessa had helped Nathaniel with a public event, and the two spent hours discussing business strategies and future collaborations. However, the chemistry between them was undeniable. They began exchanging secretive text messages, and soon their business meetings turned into personal rendezvous. Nathaniel, who had always prided himself on being a dedicated husband and father, found himself falling for Vanessa's charms. She made him feel alive again in a way that Sophia could no longer do. Sophia, in the meantime, started to notice the changes in Nathaniel. He was working late more often, and when he did come home, he was distant and distracted. The love letters, the flowers, and the sweet gestures that had once defined their relationship were replaced by cold indifference. He was becoming a stranger to her, and it hurt. One evening, Sophia decided to confront him. She had noticed that his phone had been buzzing with texts all night. When she asked him about it, Nathaniel dismissed her questions and became irritated. "You're always asking about my business," he said sharply. "Can't you just trust me for once?" But Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man she had married, the man she had given her heart to, was slipping away from her. As days turned into weeks, Sophia's growing unease began to morph into a profound sense of isolation. The twin children, Ethan and Emma, were growing up fast, and though Sophia adored every moment with them, she couldn't help but feel as though she was raising them alone. Nathaniel was hardly ever home. When he was, he'd retreat into his study for hours, leaving her to handle everything. She was left with a sprawling mansion, pristine furniture, and an empty marriage. At first, she had made excuses for him. She understood the demands of his business, but with each passing day, it became clearer that something more was amiss. The man she once knew, affectionate, attentive, loving, had disappeared, replaced by a distant stranger more concerned with his empire than his own family. She began to confide in her older sister, Lillian Martins, who had always been a voice of reason. Lillian was a lawyer, strong-willed, and practical, someone who knew how to cut through the noise and make decisions without being swayed by emotions. They had always been close, but this time, Sophia couldn't hide her pain. Lillian listened intently, her eyes scanning her sister's face, filled with concern. "Sophia, I know you're holding on to something you think is still there, but sometimes people change, and we're left trying to hold on to what's already slipping through our fingers," Lillian said gently, but firmly. It was a hard truth for Sophia to hear, and it stung. But there was something about Lillian's calm demeanor that made it impossible to ignore. Over the following weeks, Lillian helped Sophia organize her thoughts and emotions. She wasn't just offering sympathy. She was helping her sister see the situation with clarity. They began talking about the practicalities of life, the finances, the business, the potential next steps. Lillian, ever the lawyer, was already formulating a strategy for Sophia's protection in case things were to take a turn for the worse. Sophia wasn't ready to believe that Nathaniel could betray her. After all, they had built a life together. But when she began to notice receipts for gifts she didn't recognize, luxurious handbags, jewelry, and high-end clothing, all addressed to Vanessa Hudson, it was hard to ignore the reality. These weren't gifts she had ever received. Sophia's heart sank as she pieced together the puzzle. The gut-wrenching truth that Nathaniel had been unfaithful to her, that the man she had loved so deeply had given his affections to someone else, hit her like a ton of bricks. She felt a deep sense of betrayal. The resentment began to build up slowly, like a slow-moving storm that was about to break. Yet, in her calm, Sophia didn't confront Nathaniel immediately. She knew that would be futile. Instead, she chose to stay silent and observe. As much as the pain gnawed at her, she was no longer the naive, hopeful woman who had fallen in love with him years ago. She was a mother, a wife, and a woman with a dignity that would not be trampled upon. And now, more than ever, she realized that she would have to stand strong for herself and for her children. Sophia began keeping a journal, documenting every interaction, every clue that could confirm her worst suspicions. She started secretly researching how to protect her assets, quietly consulting with Lillian and a trusted financial advisor, trying to figure out how to prepare herself for whatever would come next. She wasn't naive enough to think her husband would come to his senses. It was clear he was lost in the allure of a new life, one that didn't include the responsibilities of family. Yet, Sophia still clung to hope, albeit faintly, that one day Nathaniel would realize the preciousness of what he had, of their life together. But deep down, she also knew the truth. The man she had married, the man who had once seen her as his equal, had already made his choice. And she was no longer a part of it. As the months wore on, the distance between Nathaniel and Sophia widened, and his relationship with Vanessa Hudson became even more pronounced. Nathaniel, now thoroughly entangled in his affair, began to show his true colors. The public events, the galas, and the high-profile dinners that once included Sophia were now reserved for Vanessa. He no longer cared to hide his infidelity, flaunting it in front of anyone who would notice. The once tight-knit bond between Nathaniel and his family began to crumble as he immersed himself deeper into his double life. While Sophia was busy caring for their children, maintaining their household, and managing a growing sense of resentment, Nathaniel was building a new world. Vanessa became his muse, his escape from the responsibilities of his previous life, and he showered her with extravagant gifts, the finest clothes, and lavish vacations. He took Vanessa to the most exclusive restaurants and took her on business trips, making her his plus one at every event. Meanwhile, Sophia spent her days in the mansion, feeling like a ghost of the woman she once was. She had been reduced to nothing more than a caretaker of their home and children, while her husband, once her partner, became a stranger. The final blow came when Nathaniel opened a boutique for Vanessa. The store was located in an upscale part of the city, filled with luxurious clothing and accessories that catered to the wealthy elite. It was meant to be a symbol of Vanessa's success, a success that Nathaniel had fueled with his wealth and connections. The boutique became a second home for Vanessa, where Nathaniel often visited her during work hours, whispering sweet nothings in her ear and showing off his wealth. When Sophia learned of the boutique, she was crushed. It was as though Nathaniel had publicly proclaimed that his devotion to her and their family had ceased. He had invested in Vanessa's dreams, and his own family, his children, had become an afterthought. There were nights when Sophia would sit in the large, empty house, watching the twins sleep, and wonder where it all went wrong. The life they had built together, dreams, love, and ambition, was unraveling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had tried to reach Nathaniel, to make him understand, but he had become so blinded by his affair that he refused to even acknowledge her pain. At that point, Sophia knew it wasn't just the betrayal of her marriage, it was the slow erosion of her own identity. She had lost herself in trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and the perfect partner. But now she had to find herself again. It was during one of the darkest nights in their marriage that Sophia finally reached her breaking point. Nathaniel had returned home late from a business trip, something he had done more frequently in the past year, and walked straight past her without so much as a word. He had been distant for so long, but this time, his silence was deafening. Sophia stood in the doorway of their master bedroom, staring at the back of the man she had once adored. He was no longer the man she had married. He had changed, and the man who stood before her now was someone unrecognizable. Her heart, once so full of love, was now filled with anger and despair. The realization that he was no longer committed to their family, that his devotion had shifted to someone else, shattered her. But what hurt the most was that he no longer even attempted to hide it. The phone calls, the texts, the constant presence of Vanessa, Sophia had seen it all, and it had finally dawned on her that she was no longer a priority. That night, Nathaniel returned home later than usual, with Vanessa by his side. They had just attended a business gala, where Nathaniel had proudly paraded his new mistress around for all to see. As Sophia was preparing dinner for their children, she felt the familiar ache of betrayal surge within her. She looked over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. Nathaniel entered the kitchen with Vanessa, his arm casually draped around her waist. Sophia, who had always been the one to welcome him with a warm embrace, felt nothing but cold indifference at that moment. Nathaniel glanced at her as if she were a mere obstacle, his eyes filled with apathy. "We're having dinner with Vanessa tonight," he said, his tone dismissive. "I need you to pack the kids' things. You'll be leaving soon." The words hit Sophia like a slap in the face. Divorce. In that instant, everything that she had feared, everything that had slowly been building over the years, came crashing down. Nathaniel handed her a divorce letter, and without any hint of remorse, he told her to leave. "You and the kids are holding me back. I need to explore new things. You're just stopping my fun," he added, as if his words didn't wound her deeply. "You can't be the one to tell me what I need, Nathaniel," Sophia said softly, but with a newfound strength. Her eyes, once filled with tears, now burned with a quiet fire. "I will leave. But know this, I won't beg you to stay. And I won't tolerate being treated like this anymore." And with that, she dropped her apron and turned away, taking her children in her arms and walking out of the mansion. No tears, no second chances, just a woman who had finally reclaimed her own worth. The day Sophia left the mansion, carrying her twin children in her arms, felt real. There was no anger, no outbursts, only a painful quietness as she walked away from the life she had once known. She had never imagined that she would one day leave Nathaniel in such a way, but the reality of his betrayal had cut deeper than anything she had ever felt. With each step she took, leaving the opulent home behind, she felt a mixture of liberation and heartbreak. She had longed for a life of happiness with her husband, but now, that dream was shattered. Her mind was clear now, focused on moving forward for herself and her children. The divorce papers she had received were a formal acknowledgement of a relationship that had ended long before the official separation. Meanwhile, Nathaniel didn't seem to miss a beat. He was too busy basking in the attention of his mistress, Vanessa. As soon as Sophia left, Nathaniel wasted no time in celebrating his newfound freedom. He threw a lavish party at the mansion, inviting his business associates, friends, and of course, Vanessa. It was the start of a new chapter for him, one that he thought would bring him joy and pleasure. With his marriage over, he could now live the life he had always dreamed of, full of indulgence, parties, and zero responsibilities. He even mocked Sophia's departure, laughing with his friends, calling her too dependent and pathetic for not being able to hold on to him. As the wine flowed freely and the music thumped through the mansion's grand halls, Nathaniel reveled in his newfound life, completely oblivious to the storm that was silently brewing on the horizon. Sophia, on the other hand, wasn't wallowing in her pain. Instead, she took charge. After leaving Nathaniel's home, she temporarily moved into a modest, but comfortable apartment with her children. The transition wasn't easy, but she was determined to start over. Despite everything that had happened, she knew one thing for sure: she was not going to let Nathaniel's betrayal define her. For the first time in a long while, she could breathe freely. There were no secrets, no hidden lies, and no constant presence of someone who treated her as though she was invisible. The love she had once given him had been thrown aside, but she would channel that love into herself and her children. While she adjusted to this new life, Sophia kept her plans close to her chest. With the support of Lillian, her lawyer's sister, they began preparing for the next steps. What Nathaniel didn't realize was that Sophia had already been gathering evidence for months. Every luxury item he had bought for Vanessa, every receipt from lavish vacations and dinners, and every piece of his affair, Sophia had documented it all. With Lillian's expertise, they began securing assets in Sophia's name, transferring ownership of various properties and investments to ensure that she was protected. As they worked quietly behind the scenes, they knew that the fight for the future of the business empire that Nathaniel had built was far from over. Sophia wasn't going to let Nathaniel ruin her, and she wasn't going to let him destroy everything they had worked for. She would build something new, and she would do it without him. The following days after her departure were spent in quiet reflection for Sophia. She had moved out of the mansion, away from the life that once defined her. She was no longer the woman who stood beside Nathaniel, the woman who had once believed in their shared dreams and vision. Now, she was a woman rebuilding her life from the ashes of her past. She spent countless hours with her children, making sure they felt safe and loved. The twins were a constant reminder of the life she had with Nathaniel, the love they had shared, the family they had built. But now, that love seemed like a distant memory, one that could never be resurrected. They were no longer a family, and she had to accept that reality. Though Sophia was now free from Nathaniel, she didn't feel the need to make her departure an explosive spectacle. She had already said what needed to be said when she left the mansion. She was done. The confrontation was over. She had already come to terms with what her future held. But what she had yet to do was show Nathaniel that she was more than the woman he had treated like a mere accessory in his life. He thought he could discard her, and now, she was quietly planning her revenge, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. She was going to prove to him, and to herself, that she was capable of standing tall on her own. As Nathaniel partied with Vanessa and his friends, unaware of the storm that was brewing, Sophia took a different path. Her lawyer's sister, Lillian, was there for her every step of the way, guiding her through the legal complexities of the divorce and ensuring that Sophia's assets were secured. Together, they formulated a plan to not only protect what was rightfully hers but to take control of the future. Sophia knew she needed to act fast, and her first step was to gather all the financial documents, including statements from the business and investment accounts. Sophia had spent years supporting Nathaniel's dreams, but now it was time for her to pursue her own path, and it was going to be one where she called the shots. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to thrive. Nathaniel had underestimated her. He thought she was weak, that she was nothing without him, but he was wrong. She had always been stronger than he gave her credit for. And soon, he would see that for himself. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about getting back at him, it was about taking back control of her life. This was her chance to rebuild everything, and she was ready for it. Months passed, and while Nathaniel continued his lavish lifestyle with Vanessa, Sophia worked tirelessly to secure her position. Behind closed doors, she had been quietly transferring assets into her name, using her legal expertise and Lillian's connections to ensure that Nathaniel had no claim to them. Sophia knew that she had to play this game smart. He had underestimated her before, and she would make sure that she wouldn't be caught off guard again. The process was meticulous, requiring long hours of paperwork and careful navigation of their joint accounts, investments, and business holdings. But with Lillian's help, they made sure that nothing slipped through the cracks. Sophia's ultimate goal was to take control of the company that Nathaniel had built, a company that she had been heavily involved in, despite her role as a stay-at-home mother. She knew the ins and outs of the business better than anyone. She had spent years supporting Nathaniel's decisions, attending meetings, and advising him behind the scenes. The business was her blood, sweat, and tears, just as much as it was his. And now, she was ready to take it all. Sophia had already started making moves, ensuring that her name was attached to the company's ownership and that she held the majority of the shares. It wasn't something Nathaniel would have ever suspected. He had always thought of her as little more than his wife, his partner in name only. But Sophia was far more than that. She had always been capable, always had the strength to lead. And now, she would prove it. It wasn't long before Nathaniel realized that something was off. His control over the company was slipping through his fingers. It was happening so subtly that he didn't notice until it was too late. He started seeing changes in the company's direction, decisions being made without his approval, and financial reports that showed something he couldn't quite understand. It was only when he tried to access his accounts and found them frozen that he realized the truth. Sophia had taken control. She had quietly, methodically, taken everything from him. The business, the money, the power, it was all in her hands now. In that moment, Nathaniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had lost everything. And now, he would have to face the consequences of his own arrogance and neglect. As Nathaniel's world began to unravel, Vanessa Hudson, the woman who had once been his constant companion and source of indulgence, started to notice the cracks in the foundation of their relationship. She had never truly loved Nathaniel. Her interest in him had always been rooted in his wealth and the luxurious lifestyle he had provided. At first, it had been exciting, the expensive dinners, the overseas vacations, the endless shopping sprees. She reveled in the attention he showered on her, in the way he made her feel like she was the most important person in the room. But as time went on, her affection for him began to wane. The glitz and glamour no longer held the same allure. Vanessa had always been more interested in security than in genuine love, and the security that Nathaniel had once provided was beginning to fade. His business empire was crumbling, and she could feel the shift. She wasn't foolish enough to believe that the wealth she had enjoyed would last forever. She had always known that Nathaniel's power was built on a precarious foundation, and now that foundation was beginning to crack. It wasn't just the dwindling wealth that concerned Vanessa. It was also the realization that Nathaniel was no longer the man she had first met. The once confident, sharp businessman had become a shadow of his former self. He had grown increasingly erratic, neglecting the business that had made him a billionaire in the first place. Vanessa had always been used to getting what she wanted, and the more Nathaniel ignored her, the more she began to resent him. But it wasn't just Nathaniel's faults that led Vanessa to make a decision. It was the presence of Derek, her longtime boyfriend. Derek had always known about her affair with Nathaniel, but he had been willing to turn a blind eye to it, knowing that his relationship with Vanessa would provide him with a foothold in Nathaniel's world. He had been content to allow her to play her part as Nathaniel's mistress as long as it meant that they could continue to enjoy the perks of his wealth. However, when the signs of Nathaniel's impending downfall became too obvious to ignore, Derek made it clear that he was no longer willing to stand by and watch Vanessa waste her time on a man who was falling from grace. Vanessa's eyes opened to the reality of her situation. Derek's patience had run out, and he had made it clear that he was ready to take the next step with her. He was ready to marry her. He had already begun to make plans, and Vanessa knew that she would have to make a choice. Nathaniel had become a liability, a fading star in her world of glamour. Derek, on the other hand, was a much safer bet. He wasn't a billionaire, but he had money, ambition, and a steady future ahead of him. Vanessa's decision was made. She would leave Nathaniel, and she would be with Derek. It was a cold, calculated move, but Vanessa had never been one to make decisions based on emotion. She saw people as tools to help her achieve her goals, and Nathaniel had outlived his usefulness. She began to pull away from him, gradually distancing herself emotionally and physically. She no longer attended the lavish parties or posed for photos with him at public events. Instead, she began spending more time with Derek, having secret meetings, and making plans for a future that didn't involve Nathaniel at all. The day Vanessa finally left Nathaniel was one of the most humiliating moments of his life. He had always prided himself on his power and success, but now, he was watching as the woman he had thought would be by his side through thick and thin walked away without a second glance. He tried to hold onto her, tried to convince her that things would get better, that he could turn things around, but it was too late. Vanessa had made her decision. She was done with him. She walked away, leaving Nathaniel standing in the ruins of his own making. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was a reality he could no longer avoid. The woman he had chosen over his wife had abandoned him, just as he had abandoned Sophia years ago. The cruel irony of the situation hit him hard. He had thought that by leaving Sophia for Vanessa, he had found a better life, a life full of excitement and passion. But now, that life had crumbled around him, and he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his decisions. The fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. Once, Nathaniel had been the king of his world, a powerful businessman whose name was synonymous with success. He had it all: wealth, power, admiration. He had a beautiful wife, twin children, and a life that many would have envied. But now, as the weeks passed in the aftermath of his divorce, it became painfully clear that the life he had once known was slipping through his fingers. His business empire, once a well-oiled machine, was now plagued by dysfunction. Deals were falling apart. Investors were pulling out. partners were bailing. Nathaniel had failed to realize that his obsession with personal indulgence had distracted him from the very thing that had made him successful, his business acumen. He had allowed his marriage, his family, and his company to crumble in the pursuit of pleasure. Now, he was paying the price. His mansion, once a symbol of his success, was no longer his. It had been sold off to pay debts, and he found himself living in a small, dingy apartment. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the exotic vacations, they were all gone. Nathaniel had lost everything. The once proud billionaire had become a mere shadow of his former self, reduced to living a life that was a far cry from the opulence he had once enjoyed. The people who had once praised him now avoided him, no longer willing to associate with a man who had fallen from the heights of wealth and power. Victor, Nathaniel's best friend and business partner, had tried to warn him. He had seen the warning signs, the lack of focus, the obsession with parties and pleasure, the neglect of the business. But Nathaniel had ignored him, dismissing his concerns as unimportant. Now, Victor had moved on. He had his own business to run and didn't have time for someone who had failed to keep his empire afloat. The once solid friendship between them had dissolved, and Nathaniel found himself utterly alone. As Nathaniel sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the walls that once held memories of a life he could never return to, the weight of his mistakes hit him harder than ever before. He had believed that his wealth and power could protect him from the consequences of his actions, but he had been wrong. He had hurt the people who loved him most, and now he had no one left to turn to. His children, who had once looked up to him with admiration, now barely acknowledged his existence. Sophia, the woman who had stood by him through everything, was thriving without him, and he was powerless to stop it. Sophia stood tall in the boardroom, her once quiet demeanor now replaced with a fierce confidence that matched the power she had quietly built. It was a transformation that no one had expected, least of all Nathaniel, who had dismissed her as nothing more than a housewife. She had once devoted herself entirely to her family, nurturing her children, supporting Nathaniel through his business ventures, and standing by him during the years that had seen their empire rise. But when the betrayal became too much to ignore, when the insults and neglect piled up, Sophia had quietly begun to make plans. She had turned her pain into motivation, her heartbreak into determination. What Nathaniel had failed to realize was that while he had been busy drowning in his own indulgences, Sophia had been laying the groundwork for a future of her own. Sophia's sister, Lillian Martins, had been her rock during this difficult time. Lillian was a sharp, intelligent lawyer who had always been a pillar of support for Sophia. She knew her sister's strength and potential long before Sophia ever realized it herself. When Sophia found the evidence of Nathaniel's affair, the receipts for expensive gifts, the boutique he had bought for Vanessa, Lillian had stepped in to guide her through the legal intricacies of securing what was rightfully hers. They had worked together, quietly and methodically, to transfer assets into Sophia's name without Nathaniel's knowledge. It was a strategic move that would ensure that when the time came, Sophia would have the power to take back what was hers and claim the future she had always deserved. But Sophia didn't just want to survive. She wanted to thrive. She knew that the business Nathaniel had built was fragile. It was his arrogance and neglect that had led to its downfall, and now, it was her turn to rebuild it into something even more powerful. She took control of the company, becoming its new CEO. What once seemed like an impossible dream for a woman who had been relegated to the role of a housewife was now a reality. The board members, many of whom had underestimated her for years, quickly saw the force she had become. They were impressed by her intelligence, her determination, and her ability to turn the company around. In a matter of months, Sophia had begun to make bold decisions that brought the business back to life. Profits soared, new deals were signed, and the company regained its reputation as one of the most successful in its industry. But it wasn't just the business that was flourishing. Sophia's personal life was also taking shape in ways she had never imagined. She had rediscovered herself, her strength, her resilience, her passion for success. She spent her days working tirelessly, but she also made time for her children, Ethan and Emma. The twins, once caught in the crossfire of their parents' bitter relationship, had flourished under her care. They were happy, confident, and well-adjusted. Sophia had become not only a successful businesswoman but also a devoted mother who was creating a new future for her family. She bought a beautiful new home for herself and her children, a place where they could start fresh, away from the painful memories of their past life with Nathaniel. As Sophia's life began to shine in ways she had never dreamed possible, Nathaniel's life continued to spiral into darkness. He was watching from the sidelines, helpless to do anything about it. His company, once his pride and joy, was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. The lavish lifestyle he had enjoyed had become a distant memory. The mansion, the cars, the designer clothes, none of it mattered anymore. He was alone. His friends had abandoned him, his business partners were no longer interested in doing business with him, and his children wanted nothing to do with him. The cold reality of his mistakes hit him with full force, but the true weight of his loss was not just in his financial ruin. It was in the absence of the one person who had always been there for him, Sophia. Sophia had been the heart of their empire. She had been the steady force behind his success, the person who kept their family and their business together. Without her, Nathaniel was nothing. But he had never realized that until it was too late. As Sophia rose to the top, Nathaniel's fall became even more tragic. He watched from afar as she took the reins of the company he had built and turned it into something even more powerful. He had always taken her for granted, always thought of her as weaker, less capable than him. Now, the reality was that she was the one who had truly held everything together, while he had squandered it all. Nathaniel's regret was palpable, but it was too late for apologies. He had made his bed, and now he was lying in it. The man who had once been the king of his world, who had once believed that wealth and power would protect him from the consequences of his actions, was now a mere shadow of his former self. Meanwhile, Sophia, the woman he had humiliated and discarded, had risen from the ashes and built a new life for herself and her children. The contrast between their lives was striking, and it was a painful reminder of just how far Nathaniel had fallen. Nathaniel sat in the small, dimly lit apartment that had become his reality after everything had fallen apart. The walls were bare, save for a few old paintings that reminded him of the wealth and grandeur he had once lived in. He had traded in his mansion, sports cars, and designer clothes for a life of solitude and regret. Every morning, he woke up to the same crushing truth: he had lost everything. His company, once a thriving empire, was now in ruins. His children, who once filled his life with joy, had become strangers, refusing to see him after his betrayal. His friends, his partners, everyone who had once surrounded him in his circle of success, had vanished. And the one person who had always believed in him, always stood by him, was now a powerful force in her own right, thriving in ways he could never have imagined. It had been months since the divorce, but the sting of it hadn't gone away. In fact, it had only deepened with time. He had thought that once he got rid of Sophia, once he had freed himself from the chains of family life, he would be able to live the carefree existence he had longed for. He thought that with Vanessa by his side, he would be able to have the life he had always dreamed of: luxury, excitement, and endless indulgence. But the reality had been different. Vanessa had left him. The moment his financial situation crumbled, so did the illusion of their relationship. She had only been interested in him for what he could provide, and once that was gone, so was she. Now, Nathaniel was alone. His phone, which used to ring incessantly with business calls and invitations to social events, lay silent on the coffee table. The only calls he received were from creditors and former associates, reminding him of the debts he could no longer pay. He had become a shadow of the man he once was, a man who had once believed that his wealth and power made him invincible. But those things had proven to be nothing more than illusions. It was his arrogance, his pride, and his neglect of the people who truly mattered that had brought him to this point. He had treated Sophia like an afterthought, a trophy to show off in public, but never truly appreciating the person she was or the sacrifices she made. Now, as he sat in his lonely apartment, he couldn't help but wonder how things could have been different. His thoughts were constantly consumed with Sophia. Her face, once a source of comfort, now haunted him. He remembered the way she had stood by him during the early years of their marriage, the way she had supported him when he had nothing, when they had struggled to make ends meet. She had believed in him when no one else did. She had been his rock. But he had taken her for granted. He had dismissed her, insulted her, and humiliated her in front of others. He had ignored her needs and focused only on his own desires. Now, he could see how wrong he had been. Sophia had never been weak. She had always been stronger than he realized, and it was her strength that had ultimately led her to take control of the business and build a future for herself and their children. Nathaniel knew that she was thriving now, and that thought filled him with a mixture of jealousy and admiration. But more than that, he felt guilt. Guilt for the way he had treated her. Guilt for the way he had abandoned their children. Guilt for the lies he had told. He thought back to the moments when he had made those decisions, the late nights spent at the office, the business trips that turned into romantic getaways with Vanessa, the constant dismissals of Sophia's concerns. At the time, he had thought it was all worth it. He had thought that wealth and status were the only things that mattered. But now, sitting alone in his apartment, he realized how empty it all was. His wealth, his fame, none of it could fill the void left by the loss of his family. He longed to reach out to Sophia, to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness. But he knew that it was too late. She had moved on. She had found her strength, her independence, and her success. And that made him feel even more helpless. He had never truly understood Sophia's worth until it was too late. Now, he would have to live with the consequences of his actions. Nathaniel's loneliness was suffocating. He had no one to turn to. His old friends had turned their backs on him, seeing him as a cautionary tale of hubris. His business partners had moved on to other ventures, and the company he had once been so proud of was now in the hands of Sophia. He had no one left but himself, and even that seemed like too much to bear. The man who had once been on top of the world now found himself at rock bottom, facing the harsh reality of his choices. Nathaniel stood outside the towering glass building that housed Sophia's new office. He had arrived early, his palms clammy and his heart pounding in his chest. The once confident and assertive man who had commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals now found himself struggling with the simplest of emotions, fear. His pride, once an impenetrable shield, had long since been shattered by his mistakes, and now, standing on the precipice of desperation, he wondered if he had anything left to salvage. The walk from his car to the entrance felt like an eternity. He had made this journey many times before, but never like this. Never with the knowledge that everything he had built was now crumbling, that he had driven the person who had been his partner, his equal, his support, to the point of no return. It was one thing to lose a business deal, a car, or even a mansion. It was quite another to lose the love of your life and the family you had so recklessly discarded. As Nathaniel stepped into the sleek, modern lobby of the building, he felt a rush of anxiety flood through him. The lobby was pristine, gleaming with polished marble floors and walls adorned with modern art. It was a far cry from the old, luxurious spaces he was accustomed to. But this was Sophia's world now, not his. This was her empire, built from the ground up after he had abandoned her. And yet, here he was, reduced to this moment of vulnerability, standing at the edge of a future that seemed as if it were no longer his to claim. He made his way to the elevator, the weight of his own guilt nearly suffocating him. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. He could feel the eyes of the few employees who were in the building that early morning following him, perhaps wondering who this disheveled man was. They had no idea that the man who had once been at the pinnacle of success, the one they had probably read about in the tabloids, was now a mere shadow of his former self. As the elevator ascended, Nathaniel found his mind wandering back to the moments of his greatest arrogance, the times when he had belittled Sophia, dismissing her efforts and undermining her worth. He recalled the parties he had thrown, the lavish gifts he had bought for Vanessa, and how he had openly flaunted his mistress in front of Sophia. He had been so blinded by his own desires, so obsessed with his wealth and power, that he failed to see how much he was hurting the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin. Now, it was all crashing down around him. His mind raced with thoughts of how to salvage whatever he could, how to convince Sophia to take him back. He had never been good at admitting he was wrong, but in this moment, he realized that pride was no longer an option. His children refused to speak to him, and the truth was, he had no one left. He needed Sophia, not just to restore his reputation, but to heal the part of him that had died the moment he lost her. The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor. Nathaniel stepped out, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the vast office space. He was met by a secretary who, though polite, could not hide the wariness in her eyes. She likely knew who he was, knew what he had done, and probably knew why he was here. "Mr. Williams," the secretary said cautiously, "Sophia is expecting you." Expecting him? Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. Did she already know why he was here? Had she heard rumors of his regret and his desire to make amends? Or was she simply bracing herself for what she knew was coming, his desperate plea for forgiveness? Sophia's office door was open, and as Nathaniel approached, he saw her sitting behind her sleek, minimalist desk, her back to him as she reviewed documents. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The woman who had once been his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, looked so different now. She had always been beautiful, but now there was a strength about her that radiated from every pore. She no longer looked like the quiet housewife he had once ignored. She was a woman who had found herself, who had reclaimed her power, and who no longer needed him. And that truth, though painful, was one Nathaniel knew he had to accept. Sophia didn't turn around immediately. She had heard the sound of his footsteps approaching, but she didn't rush to greet him. Instead, she continued to focus on the paperwork in front of her, giving him a moment to take in the reality of what he had lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, but there was an undeniable edge of firmness. "Nathaniel," she said without turning, "I assume you know why you're here." Nathaniel swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of his words before he even spoke them. This was his chance, the moment he had been dreading but knew had to come. "Sophia," he began, his voice shaking, I don't know how to start. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything. I was blind, selfish, and cruel. I took you for granted, and I'm sorry for that. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I regret everything. I was a fool, and I don't know how to fix it. But please, I beg you, give me another chance." Sophia remained silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them like a vast chasm, and Nathaniel couldn't tell if she was considering his words or simply trying to decide whether or not to entertain the idea of speaking to him at all. He took a step closer to her, his voice pleading now, raw with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he continued, "but please, please don't shut me out completely. I've learned the hardest lesson of my life. I've lost everything that truly mattered. And if I can't get you back, then I've truly lost it all." Sophia slowly turned her chair toward him, her gaze locking with his. There was no trace of the woman he once knew, meek, willing to forgive him, always looking for the good in him. Instead, she met his eyes with a quiet strength, a power that both humbled and terrified him. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice firm but calm, "I've moved on. I've rebuilt my life, not for you, not because of you, but because of who I am. You were never the reason I stood by your side. I did it because I believed in us, in our family. But you didn't. You didn't believe in me. And now, I am stronger than ever. I'm a mother, a businesswoman, and I don't need your apology to move forward." Her words hit him like a tidal wave. He felt the sting of her rejection deeply, but beneath it, he knew she was right. He had never believed in her the way he should have. He had always seen her as secondary to his own desires. But now, she was a force to be reckoned with. Sophia rose from her desk, the motion purposeful and deliberate. She walked toward him, her heels clicking against the floor with authority. Nathaniel stood frozen, waiting for the words that would either save or destroy him completely. "I'm sorry, Nathaniel," she said, her voice unwavering. "But you're too late." The silence that hung between Nathaniel and Sophia was unbearable. Every moment felt like an eternity as Nathaniel stood there, waiting, hoping for some glimmer of mercy. But the woman before him was not the same woman he had married. She was not the woman who would accept his apology with open arms, who would forgive him for his cruelty and neglect. She had evolved into something far stronger, far more resolute. And now, in front of him, she was about to make a decision that would permanently alter the course of both their lives. Sophia's gaze never wavered from his. Her eyes, once soft and filled with the quiet pain of unspoken words, were now sharp and unwavering, radiating a sense of power and confidence that Nathaniel had never seen before. She had always been kind and compassionate, even when he didn't deserve it, but the pain he had inflicted upon her had transformed her. The strength he had overlooked for years now seemed unbreakable. "You've come to me, expecting me to forgive you, expecting me to open the door to the past, to everything you destroyed," Sophia said calmly, her voice a steady rhythm of finality. "But you forget one thing, Nathaniel. The past is gone. And I am no longer that woman you think you can manipulate." The words were like a slap to his face, but they were necessary. The truth stung, and Nathaniel felt the weight of it in every inch of his body. For years, he had thought of himself as the one who held the power, the one who made the decisions. But now, standing before him, Sophia had taken control of her own destiny. She no longer needed him. She had never truly needed him, not in the way he had thought. She had stayed out of love, yes, but also because she had believed in their family, in the potential they had together. And he had squandered it all. Sophia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing as she continued, her words now sharp with certainty. "I've made my decision, Nathaniel. I will not be your doormat. I will not be the woman you throw aside when it suits you. You humiliated me, belittled me, and abandoned your children, thinking I would always be here, waiting for you to change. But I've changed. I am not the same woman who once cried herself to sleep, wondering where you were. I am stronger now, and I refuse to go back to a life of pain, a life of being ignored and neglected." Nathaniel's heart shattered as he heard her words, but deep down, he knew they were true. He had done this to her. He had treated her like a shadow in his life, someone who didn't matter, someone who was only good enough when it was convenient for him. And now, he was paying the price. The realization that he had lost her forever sank deep into his chest, and he felt a wave of guilt that was almost suffocating. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I was blind. I was foolish. But please, please don't do this. Don't walk away from me. I need you." But Sophia shook her head, her expression unreadable. "You don't need me, Nathaniel. You need someone who will tolerate your cruelty, who will accept the scraps you throw their way. But I am no longer that person. I've built a life without you, and I am thriving. I am happy, Nathaniel. And the one thing you can't take away from me is my peace. You've already taken enough from me." Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Nathaniel had always thought he could control everything around him. He had built an empire, surrounded himself with yes-men, and had convinced himself that he could always fix things with money, charm, or manipulation. But Sophia had shown him that there was one thing money could never buy: respect. She had earned her own respect, and now she had earned her freedom. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier now stung his eyes, but he refused to let them escape. He was no longer the man he once was. He was a shell of his former self, the reality of his actions sinking in. He had lost everything he had once cherished, his family, his wife, his children, and his empire. All of it was gone, and the weight of that loss pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Sophia turned her back on him, her movements deliberate and graceful, and walked toward the window. She gazed out over the city, her figure framed by the expansive view. For a moment, Nathaniel saw the woman she had become, strong, independent, unbroken. He had known she was capable of greatness, but he had never truly seen it until now. She wasn't just a victim of his cruelty. She was a force in her own right. And it was that force, that unshakable resolve, that had driven him to this moment of reckoning. As Sophia looked out the window, her voice broke the silence. "I've given you enough chances, Nathaniel. I've allowed you to break my heart too many times. But I'm done. I'm finished. I am no longer the woman who will wait for you to change. And you will never have the chance to hurt me again." Nathaniel stood there, his body heavy with the weight of her rejection. He had come to beg for forgiveness, to plead for a second chance, but what he had received instead was the undeniable truth that his actions had consequences, and that no amount of begging would erase the damage he had done. As Sophia turned back to face him, her eyes cold and resolute, Nathaniel knew that this was the end. There would be no reconciliation, no turning back. He had destroyed everything that had once been good in his life, and now, he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own choices. With a final, lingering look, Sophia turned away from him and left the room, leaving Nathaniel standing alone, swallowed by the emptiness he had created. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Nathaniel's life had fallen apart in a way he had never imagined. His mansion had been sold off, the luxurious cars he had once shown off to his friends now belonged to strangers. His business empire, once his pride and joy, was in ruins. The world he had built for himself was nothing more than a memory now, a painful reminder of his hubris and betrayal. Meanwhile, Sophia's life had flourished. With the full support of her sister Lillian and a team of loyal allies, she had taken control of the company Nathaniel had once considered his own. She was now the CEO of the company, and under her leadership, it had thrived. The company was not just surviving. It was growing, expanding into new markets and achieving the kind of success Nathaniel had never dreamed of. Sophia had also found peace in her personal life. She had bought a new home, one that was a far cry from the mansion Nathaniel had once filled with empty promises. It was a home filled with love, laughter, and the sound of her children, Ethan and Emma, growing up in a safe, nurturing environment. She had made sure they knew they were her priority, and that was all that mattered to her now. Sophia had also found a new purpose. She began to speak publicly about her experiences, helping other women who had been through similar heartbreak and betrayal. She became a beacon of strength for others, proving that it was possible to rebuild your life after betrayal. She was not just a survivor, she was a warrior, and she was using her voice to help others find their own strength. And as for Nathaniel, he had to face the consequences of his actions. He had lost everything, his wealth, his family, and his reputation. He was no longer the powerful billionaire he had once been. He had been humbled in the most painful way possible, and now, he was left to rebuild his life from the ground up. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many times he reached out to Sophia, she remained firm in her decision. She had moved on, and she was no longer interested in being part of his broken world. As time passed, Nathaniel found himself in a new role, working for a small, struggling company that barely made ends meet. He had once been a king among men, but now he was just another employee, struggling to make a living. He had lost everything he had ever cared about, and the pain of that loss never left him. Meanwhile, Sophia continued to rise. She was a woman who had been broken, but who had found the strength to rebuild herself into something even greater than she had ever been. She had embraced her new life with grace and determination, and she was thriving in ways Nathaniel could never have imagined. Sophia had moved on, not just from him, but from the pain he had caused her. And in doing so, she had proven that karma always has a way of catching up with those who deserve it. In the end, Nathaniel's fall from grace was complete. He had lost his fortune, his family, and his place in the world. He spent his days working tirelessly at a job he loathed, a constant reminder of the man he had once been, and the man he had destroyed. His once celebrated name was now a shadow of its former self, and he found himself living a life of quiet desperation. Sophia, on the other hand, had become a symbol of empowerment. She was no longer the woman who had been cast aside. She was a force to be reckoned with. Her company continued to flourish, and she had earned the respect of her peers and colleagues. She had found happiness, not in revenge, but in her own strength, in the love of her children, and in the life she had built for herself. In the final act of this long and painful saga, Nathaniel was forced to acknowledge the truth: karma had caught up with him. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. And as he looked at Sophia from a distance, he realized that she had always been the stronger one. She had survived his betrayal, and in doing so, she had proven that no one, not even a billionaire, could escape the laws of justice. Sophia had won. The end.